Hey there, tonight's story takes you deep into the hidden world of the ninja, not the fantasy, but the reality. No throwing stars, no magic vanishing acts, just cold floors, silent nights, and a life built on secrecy, discomfort, and constant fear of being exposed. You won't meet a hero. There's no name to follow, only the quiet truth of what it really meant to live as a shadow in feudal Japan. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and let the silence guide you into a life that was never meant to be remembered. Most ninja did not come from castles or schools. They were born in quiet valleys, tucked into the folds of remote mountains like those in Iga and Koga. These places were not on maps that mattered to the warlords of the day. They were not centers of trade, not strongholds of power. They were villages of dirt paths and thatched roofs, where people lived by farming buckwheat, tending small fields, and gathering mushrooms from the woods. Families were large, tools were few, and winters bit hard. Life was built around silence and watching the wind, because danger didn't always come with sound. Children were raised close to the ground, taught to listen more than speak, to mend what broke, and to not ask too many questions. It was not unusual for a household to have no last name, no family crest, no standing beyond its own garden wall. That obscurity became a shield, and sometimes a profession. In these villages, there were no official schools for espionage, no banners declaring special training. The skills passed from generation to generation were quiet things. How to walk without rustling leaves, how to use a sickle for both harvest and defense, how to read the sky to know when soldiers might come. Local families shared knowledge the same way they shared firewood or miso paste. A boy might learn to fish by hand one day, and the next, learn how to cross a river without leaving a trail. It was not called training. It was called growing up. There was no formal graduation, no ceremony. A person simply became useful to their family, to their community, and sometimes to someone with more money and more power. That's when the word ninja would appear, quietly, like fog. Not as a title, more as a task. Status meant little in these places. The great clans of Japan barely acknowledged them, except when they needed something done in secret. Samurai passed through but did not stay. They had little reason to linger in villages where even the dogs barked too softly. A ninja's family might raise vegetables for local markets, repair sandals, or make charcoal. Their neighbors might never know what they really did at night, or who they slipped off to meet at the edge of the forest. There was no fame in this life, no poems written about them, no songs sung around fires. They didn't wear black. They wore whatever didn't stand out, the same faded browns and grays as the trees and the earth. And if they disappeared one day, people said nothing. Disappearing was part of living. Resources were always tight. Metal was expensive. Horses were rare. Even cloth had to be patched, washed carefully, and never wasted. Tools were shared between households. A hoe here, a bucket there. Families stored dried food high in the rafters and collected rainwater in clay pots. Life was shaped by scarcity, not strategy. That scarcity taught ingenuity, how to build a fish trap from old branches, how to dig a shelter into the hillside, how to fake a limp to distract a soldier. The skills that would one day make someone a ninja did not come from scrolls. They came from cold fingers, long walks, and the daily weight of surviving in a place the world had mostly forgotten. Being invisible was not a choice. It was the only thing anyone in those mountains ever learned to do well. Children in these villages were not sent off to be taught by strangers. Learning stayed inside the home, passed from parent to child like tools or recipes. Fathers did not sit their sons down and explain what a ninja was. They showed them how to move through brush without breaking a twig, how to step on the edge of stones to leave no mark, how to breathe through the nose when fear tried to close the throat. It began young, before boys were strong enough to lift a sickle properly, before they understood why they were watching shadows. Tasks seemed like chores at first. Gather kindling without snapping it, fetch water without spilling it, sit still through an entire rainstorm. But the expectations were always there, silent but firm. Mistakes were rarely corrected with words. The lesson was often the consequence: startled birds, a scolded glance, a skipped meal. No one said, "You're training." They simply said, "Do it again." Much of what was taught had no name. It wasn't martial arts, though it involved fighting. It wasn't strategy, though it required thinking ahead. A father might bring his child into the woods at dusk and say nothing for hours, waiting to see if the child could match his silence. Another might blindfold his son and lead him home from the stream, forcing him to memorize the ground with his feet. These lessons weren't daily. They came when the moment allowed, fitted around farm work and family obligations. But they accumulated. Over years, a child learned to hide in plain sight, to carry messages tucked under fingernails, to climb trees without bending branches. And always, they learned never to ask why. Questioning meant suspicion. Suspicion meant risk. Trust, like training, was earned slowly and could vanish in a moment. Mothers played a part, too, though it was quieter still. They taught the textures of herbs, the scents of poisons, the way to boil plants until they lost all taste but kept their purpose. They taught how to mend torn clothing without making the patch obvious, how to cook meals that left no lingering smell, how to bandage wounds without leaving threads behind. If the father taught how to enter and escape, the mother taught how to leave no trace at all. A boy might learn to gut a fish from his uncle and how to spread ash to muffle footsteps from his grandfather. Everyone in the family had something to pass down, but nothing was explained in full. The pieces made sense only after years, and by then, the child had become someone who didn't need explanations. There were no scrolls to memorize, no names to recite, no grand philosophies, just repetition, observation, and quiet correction. A child failed often, and each failure was folded into memory. How it felt to step too hard and hear a dog bark. How it felt to speak when one should have listened. The stakes weren't always life and death, but they were close enough. And as the child grew, the lessons changed. A teenager might be sent on small errands with hidden purposes. Deliver this basket, wait near that gate, follow this stranger at a distance. If they succeeded, they were told nothing. If they failed, they were told even less. Eventually, one day, without ceremony or approval, they would be sent alone into a neighboring province with a message that could not be lost. Not because they were ready, but because readiness wasn't the point. Only silence and completion mattered. The food was plain, always plain, not because of discipline or principle, but because there was little choice. Most meals were built around what could be grown, dried, or quietly gathered. White rice was a rarity, reserved for the wealthy or ceremonial occasions. What filled the bowls instead was barley, millet, or brown rice, coarse, filling, and slow to spoil. Alongside it came miso soup, made not for flavor but for warmth and balance. A few shreds of wild greens or root vegetables might swim in the broth, soft and silent. Fermented pickles, usually daikon or burdock, provided salt and a hint of sharpness. Dried mushrooms, if available, added texture. The food didn't steam in great clouds. It didn't carry its scent across the village. Meals were quiet, small, and practical, designed to feed the body without drawing attention. Nothing fried, nothing grilled. Those methods created smells and smoke. A ninja couldn't afford to be smelled before being seen. During missions, food had to be packed in a way that avoided both sound and scent. That's why hikosura, small, dense rice balls mixed with miso paste and ground seeds, were so common. They could be eaten in the dark, with 2 fingers, without chewing loudly. Sometimes dried sweet potatoes were added for energy, or sesame powder for oil. Meals were eaten in silence, not just out of necessity, but habit. No clinking bowls, no conversation, just the soft rustle of fabric and the weight of hunger being pushed back, one bite at a time. Eating wasn't a moment of rest. It was part of the job. A quiet, calculated act to keep the body going without exposing it. Fasting wasn't ceremonial. It was expected. There were days when no food came. Days when the mission stretched longer than planned, when rivers flooded, when roads were blocked, when returning to the village meant too much risk. On those days, knowledge mattered more than rations. Which plants could be chewed raw? Which bark could be boiled into something close to broth? Which insects could be eaten without sickness? Hunger was not a shock. It was a familiar ache that sharpened the senses. And when the stomach growled, a bit of cloth was tied around the midsection to hold the sound in. Nausea and fatigue became parts of the rhythm. A well-fed ninja was suspicious. One who looked tired and underfed could slip through the world unnoticed. Even at home, food wasn't indulgent. There were no sweets, no fresh meats, no layers of flavor. Fish was eaten only if caught that day, usually grilled outside and cooled completely before storage. Meat was rare and had to be salted or dried. Both expensive, both traceable. Families kept stock pots of miso paste and containers of rice tucked high in the eaves, away from rodents and damp. Water was boiled and cooled in silence. Fires were kept small, shielded behind walls or stones to hide the glow. Nothing wasted. Bones were dried and ground for powder. Vegetable scraps were dried for soup bases. Cooking was an extension of survival, not culture. The idea of taste was secondary to the idea of staying unseen. In every spoonful there was calculation. In every bite there was intent. And once the food was gone, the silence returned, as if nothing had ever been eaten at all. Training was a daily obligation, not a moment of pride or display. It didn't happen in courtyards or on polished floors. It happened in the woods, where branches struck the face and footing shifted with every step. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, bodies moved quietly through narrow trails cut into the underbrush. There were no commands, no shouted encouragement, just breath, mud, and the sound of footfalls timed with care. The path wound up and down steep hills, across creeks, along the edges of rice paddies where balance meant everything. Running wasn't for speed, but for control. Steps had to be silent, measured, and adaptable to whatever the terrain offered. Slipping meant starting over. The goal was not to impress, but to disappear, into the rhythm of the woods, into the silence of morning, into the role that demanded everything except attention. Climbing was not a sport. It was necessity. Trees, walls, rock faces all became part of the daily drill. Ropes were rarely used unless for later practical training. Most of the climbing relied on hands, knees, elbows, and bare feet. The bark scraped skin, stones tore cloth, and splinters embedded themselves without ceremony. Children climbed first in daylight, then in dusk, and finally, blindfolded, by memory alone. They learned to feel for holds with the side of the foot, to wedge the fingers between uneven crevices, to breathe shallow and steady while dangling from a ledge. Trees were used for stealth approaches, rooftops for escape drills, cliffs for endurance. Calluses were a sign of discipline, not damage. And if someone fell, they were expected to get back up without a sound. The forest did not offer comfort, only the chance to keep trying. Night training came later, and it was the hardest. No lanterns, no torches, only moonlight, if there was any. Participants moved in staggered pairs through forest routes, memorized during daylight and then navigated in full darkness. Stumbling was common, but noise was not allowed. One misstep could alert an enemy. Practice meant knowing how to hear the difference between a twig snapping underfoot and one falling from a branch. It meant feeling wind shift through trees and knowing where a trail curved. Orientation was learned not through stars, but through habit, muscle memory, and the whisper of ground underfoot. Breathing through the nose kept air silent. Wrapping the ankles in cloth softened footfalls. Sometimes the exercise was simply to find a marked tree in total darkness and return without being seen. These drills could last hours, ending with silent returns to homes already asleep. Rest came late, and it was never full. Muscles ached, feet bled, but nothing was said. Pain was folded into routine like rice into a ball, compact, familiar, and necessary. No one expected comfort. Beds were mats, baths were rivers. Soreness was a constant that faded only to return again. Bodies adapted not through bursts of effort, but through quiet repetition. There were no medals, no praise, only gradual improvement. The goal was not to be the strongest or the fastest. It was to move without being noticed, to travel far without leaving a trace, to endure without recognition. Training did not end when the body was tired. It ended when the task was done. And when the next day came, the trail through the forest waited again, unchanged and unforgiving. The most important skill was not how to fight, but how to remain unseen. Before any weapon was introduced, before any trap or poison was explained, the training focused entirely on the art of disappearing. Not through magic or tricks, but through quiet, deliberate behavior, how to move, where to stand, when to breathe. A beginner might spend an entire season learning to walk without a sound, heel never striking the ground, toes always landing first. The rhythm of steps changed depending on the surface: gravel, wood, straw, mud. The wrong cadence could give away position instantly. In some exercises, small stones were tied to the back of a trainee's feet. If they touched each other, it meant the gate was too wide. If they clinked, the student was told to begin again. Perfection didn't come through instinct, but through endless repetition of silent movement across changing terrain. Clothing was part of the lesson. Loose garments made noise. Bright colors caught the eye. Even scent mattered. Trainees learned to treat their clothes with ash or charcoal, dulling both the sound and the smell. Sandals were modified with softer soles, often wrapped in cloth or bark. Every choice had a reason, and every reason was tied to not being noticed. Sometimes, drills took place in village markets, not to blend in among crowds, but to follow someone without being seen. Students had to match the pace of strangers, memorize their paths, and mimic their shadows. Other times, they moved through forests during the day, positioning themselves behind trees, beneath leaves and within brush without leaving marks or disturbing the environment. The goal was not escape, but invisibility. Not hiding in the distance, but hiding in plain sight. Stillness was harder than movement. Many exercises required remaining in one position for long hours, curled under a floorboard, crouched in a shallow hole, or lying flat beneath a raised platform. Breathing was slowed to match the wind, Eyes were half closed to avoid the reflection of light. Even blinking was timed with care. Insects crawled, muscles cramped, but no sound could be made. Those who failed were not scolded but ignored. Invisibility required mental quiet as much as physical control. One's own heartbeat could become an enemy if not disciplined. Sound could not be eliminated, but it could be masked. A footstep made during thunder, a cough covered by a cart's passing. Students learned to wait for birds to call or dogs to bark, then move under the cover of those familiar noises. They became students of the environment, not just of themselves. Weapons came later and only as tools of last resort. The sword was no use if one was seen too early. The true weapon was access. Getting close without being noticed, completing a task without leaving a trail, disappearing before alarm could spread. That was the real goal. Students were taught how to pass through doors without creaking hinges, how to open a paper screen without moving its frame. Even the weight of their own body was managed. They learned to distribute it between foot and wall, tree and rope, to prevent strain that might cause a groan or stumble. Silence was not an accident. It was an engineered outcome. In the end, it wasn't about being lighter or faster. It was about being forgotten before anyone realized they were ever there. And for that, they trained every day, not to be strong, but to be silent. Footwear was never chosen for comfort. It was chosen for silence. The soles were not thick enough to protect from rocks or cold, and they weren't made to last long. Most were crafted from straw, hemp, or soft cloth, materials that bent with the ground and left almost no trace behind. These shoes, if they could even be called that, didn't squeak, didn't clack, and didn't leave deep prints in dirt or sand. They wore out quickly, especially on rough terrain, but that wasn't the concern. A ninja's priority wasn't durability, it was disappearing. A hard sole might echo on a wooden floor. A patterned tread might leave signs on a riverbank. So the feet stayed close to the ground, wrapped in silence, even if it meant torn skin or frostbite on cold nights. Every step had to be deliberate, measured not by speed or comfort, but by whether it could be heard. The construction of the sandals was part of the training. Young practitioners were taught to make them by hand, often using nothing more than rice straw, twisted fibers, and scraps of old cloth. The tightness of the weave, the direction of the knots, and the placement of the bindings all affected how the foot moved. A poorly made pair could unravel mid-mission or snap during a climb. Toes were often exposed, not for airflow, but for tactile awareness. Being able to feel the texture of the ground and respond to it instantly. Some even went barefoot during practice to sharpen that awareness, stepping across gravel paths or ice-covered fields until the pain became manageable. The more contact with the ground, the more information gathered with each step. Shoes, for the ninja, were not barriers between body and earth. They were sensors, designed to connect, not to protect. On wet terrain, the materials soaked through instantly. Slipping was common, and blisters were a constant companion. In winter, straw stiffened and cracked. In the summer, it collected dust and moisture. The shoes had to be replaced regularly, sometimes made on the go with whatever materials were found nearby: palm fibers, bark, or even strips of torn clothing. Some practitioners carried extra soles rolled and tied to their belt, not for backup, but to change their footprint pattern if being tracked. Leaving a consistent set of marks was dangerous. Changing the way the foot touched the ground, alternating soft cloth with bare skin, could confuse anyone trying to follow. Even weight distribution was trained. By placing pressure differently on each part of the foot, a ninja could alter the depth of their tracks. Combined with terrain awareness, These adjustments made it almost impossible to tell where they had gone, or even if anyone had been there at all. There was no standard design. Different families and regions adapted their footwear to local conditions. In muddy regions, wider soles helped avoid sinking. In mountainous zones, sandals were reinforced with bark or split bamboo. Some versions had cloth wrappings that extended up the shin, not for style, but to muffle movement through tall grass or shrubs. The rest of the clothing followed the same principles: quiet fabrics, loose fits that didn't snag, and colors that matched the environment. Buttons and metal were avoided. Even thread was selected for texture. Nothing was left to chance. Not a crease, not a seam. The feet, often ignored in other forms of training, were here a central focus. Because a ninja did not fly or vanish, they walked, they crawled, they climbed, and their feet, wrapped in silence and pain, carried the entire mission forward. The image of a ninja dressed head to toe in perfect black fabric belongs more to stage performances than to reality. In practice, the clothing was far more humble and far more practical. Pure black stood out in moonlight, against trees, rocks, and even against shadowed walls. Instead, garments were dyed in muted tones: ash gray, brown like dry earth, moss green, faded blue like river stones. These were the colors of the landscape, chosen not for uniformity, but for invisibility. The fabrics came from local materials: rough cotton, hemp, or other plant fibers. They weren't smooth, they weren't silent by nature, and they didn't fit like armor. But they were layered and loose enough to hide movement, soft enough to muffle sound, and simple enough to repair in the field. Clothing was treated with charcoal or mud to dull its shine, soaked in ash water to erase scent, and patched endlessly. A ninja's uniform wasn't a costume, it was camouflage in motion. There were no fixed patterns, no embroidery, no insignia. Garments were made at home or traded locally, shaped by the needs of terrain and season. Sleeves could be long or short, depending on humidity and brush density. Pants were tied low on the calves to avoid snagging, and waistbands held small pockets for powders, tools, or notes. Some wore an outer layer that could be reversed, one side for the forest, the other for blending into a crowd. Face coverings were used, but not always. A full mask drew attention in the wrong setting. Often, a simple scarf or head wrap was enough to hide features or blur recognition. It wasn't about total concealment, it was about not being memorable. If a passerby saw someone in dusty brown clothes and looked away, the clothing had done its job. Familiarity was more useful than mystery. Seasonal changes required adaptation. In summer, fabrics were lighter, and sweat had to be managed without leaving wet patches that might reflect light or draw insects. In winter, layers were added, but still kept thin to avoid bulk and noise. Extra padding could be stuffed with dry grass or leaves, not for warmth, but to break up the outline of the body. Nothing fit too tightly. Nothing hung too loose. Every piece of clothing had to function under movement: crouching, running, climbing, crawling. Even seams mattered. Threads had to be strong but soft, and knots hidden where they wouldn't catch. The color of a sash could match tree bark. The tone of trousers could match river mud. At night, when only outlines were visible, these small details made the difference between being seen and being forgotten. A ninja didn't vanish. He just never looked important enough to remember. No one had a wardrobe. Most owned only one or two outfits suitable for travel. When not in use, the clothing was stored carefully, away from fire smoke, away from animals, away from curiosity. Repairs were constant. Tears were inevitable. Dye faded quickly under sun and rain. But the idea wasn't to look sharp. The idea was to disappear into the background. and when clothing wore out completely, it was dismantled for straps, cloth wraps, or hidden compartments. New garments were made from old ones, stitched in silence by family members who never asked where they'd be worn. There was no ceremony to getting dressed, just quiet preparation. A soft tug at the sash, a check of the inside pocket, a breath. And then the forest swallowed the figure whole, grey on grey, brown on brown, like the land itself walking without a name. The body never moved empty. Even when dressed in plain cloth, with no visible weapons, a ninja carried tools, small, silent, and chosen with care. They weren't ornamental. Each item had multiple uses, and none of them were meant to be seen. A short length of rope, braided tightly and oiled against weather, could be used for climbing, tying, trapping, or descending a wall. It was coiled under a sash or hidden in a sleeve, not hung from the belt like a soldier's cord. Hooks, often fashioned from old nails or carved wood, were used not just to scale walls, but to lift sliding doors, remove lids, or anchor trip lines. Some were disguised as hairpins or clasps, and some were tied to fingers with silk threads no thicker than a reed stem. No tool existed on its own. Every item was chosen for its silence, concealability, and ability to blend into everyday life. Powders were perhaps the most carefully guarded. Carried in tiny bamboo containers or wax-sealed paper packets, they served a dozen purposes: blinding, itching, choking, marking, or burning. One might cause sneezing, another might leave a faint glow on a touched surface, another might flare up briefly when exposed to air. None of them were especially lethal. That wasn't the point. They were meant to confuse, distract, and disorient. A pinch thrown in the right moment could make a guard cough or turn his head just long enough to pass unseen. Others were used on pathways, spilled across a threshold to detect footsteps or measure how far someone had walked. The ninja learned not just to carry these powders, but to handle them without spilling, to seal them against moisture, and to apply them without leaving traces. The most effective tool was the one no one noticed until it was too late. Blades were small and hidden, never carried like a warrior's pride. A short knife might be strapped inside the tunic, another in the sandal, another worked into the handle of a fan or stick. They weren't for combat. They were for cutting rope, slicing through screens, or, when there was no other choice, silencing someone quickly and quietly. Some were designed to break after use, left behind as worthless fragments. Others had no handle at all, just wrapped in cloth for a single cut. The point wasn't durability, it was access. If the blade failed, the mission continued. If the blade succeeded, it was forgotten. A ninja didn't polish or display these tools. They checked the edge with a thumb, cleaned them with water and cloth, and placed them back into silence. No shine, no ornament, just function. Everything had a place. Each tool was assigned a spot in the folds of clothing or the seams of a pouch. Some were hidden inside walking sticks, others behind false panels sewn into the hem of a tunic. The arrangement was personal, refined over years of habit and trial. The goal was speed and muscle memory, not to think about where the hook or needle was, just to reach and find it there. Items were weighed for noise as well as weight. Anything that rattled was repacked, adjusted, or discarded. On missions, these tools traveled with the body like extra fingers, ready when needed, invisible when not. If captured, nothing incriminating could remain. Everything had to be discardable, replaceable, forgettable. The real skill was not in using the tools. It was in carrying them so naturally that no one, not even the person standing next to you, suspected they were there at all. Speech was a risk. Even a whisper could carry through the trees or bounce off the walls of a courtyard. In the dark, when the ear became sharper than the eye, any voice could betray a presence. That's why communication among ninja avoided words entirely during missions. Instead, they relied on signals, short, deliberate sounds and gestures agreed upon in advance and practiced until instinctive. A single whistle, high and short, might signal stop. A second, lower one could mean move. Stones were used too, flicked or dropped in certain rhythms. 1 tap meant clear, 2 meant danger, 3 meant go around. These weren't random choices. The tone, weight, and cadence were studied carefully. Each had to blend into the natural environment. A stone hitting a roof couldn't sound like a warning. It had to sound like a falling branch. The genius of these signals wasn't their clarity. It was their disguise. In close quarters, gestures took the place of sound. A flick of the fingers, a tilt of the head, a glance toward a shadow. Every motion carried meaning. These gestures were kept small, performed low to the ground or behind cover, invisible to anyone who wasn't part of the group. In teams, coordination required a shared vocabulary built without words. Every unit developed its own habits, shaped by experience and necessity. Some families used knotted cords or colored threads to send messages in advance. Others placed objects, feathers, leaves, tiny bundles, at specific locations to mark paths or indicate completed tasks. These signs were subtle enough to go unnoticed by outsiders, but clear to those who knew what to look for. Even the angle of a door left ajar could carry information. Everything was coded. Everything was hidden in plain sight. Mistakes in signaling could be deadly. A misread cue might send someone into a trap or leave an ally behind. That's why training included night exercises designed to sharpen listening and reaction. Trainees would walk in complete darkness, relying on timed signals to change direction, freeze in place, or retreat silently. Some drills involved real obstacles and real consequences. A wrong turn could mean a fall into water, a collision with a branch, or exposure to waiting observers. Over time, the body learned to respond to patterns, not guesses. The brain grew quiet. Instinct took over. A ninja didn't need to see a partner's face to know their intent. The shape of a shadow, the soft sound of cloth against bark, the quiet shift of breath, these became enough. Communication didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be precise. Even in moments of stress, when missions went wrong or environments shifted unexpectedly, the rule held firm. No talking. Not unless there was no other option. If words had to be used, they were short and stripped of all softness. No names, no explanations, no debate. And afterward, if the moment passed, silence returned as quickly as it had been broken. The world a ninja moved through at night was filled with natural noise. Wind, insects, the distant clatter of daily life winding down. The goal was to move within that sound, not against it. Signals became part of that background. Meaning hid beneath mundanity. Nothing stood out. And that was the point. The best signal was one the enemy never knew existed. The best voice was the one no one ever heard. There was no fixed bed, no familiar room waiting at the end of a day. Sleep came where it could, on dry grass beneath a lean-to, in the hollowed base of a tree, in the crawl space of an abandoned mill. The ninja could not rely on comfort or routine. Where others sought rest in warmth and walls, the ninja looked for shelter in absence. Absence of light, absence of people, absence of attention. A place too quiet might be a trap. A place too exposed could be deadly. So the choice of where to sleep became an art. Sometimes it was a patch of forest just off the trail, hidden by ferns. Sometimes the shallow space beneath a raised storage shed. Sometimes a rooftop, where the tiles were loose and the air was colder, but no one would look. Each spot chosen not for how it felt, but for how invisible it made the person inside it. Preparation for sleep took longer than sleep itself. The ground had to be checked for insects and moisture. The wind had to be tested for changes in direction that might carry scent. If there was a stream nearby, it might mask small movements, but it might also draw others. The ninja rarely undressed. Garments were loosened for breathing but kept on for speed. Tools were kept within reach, arranged the same way every night. Ropes coiled at the left, powder tucked under the edge of a cloth roll, a blade within arm's length but wrapped in cloth to prevent sound. Before closing their eyes, they listened, counting insects, watching shadows, learning the pattern of the night around them. Only then, in stillness, could rest begin. It was never deep, it was never long, but it was enough. And sometimes just enough was survival. Some nights were spent in complete exposure, lying in a rice field under stars with only a mat of straw for cover. Others were curled into attic spaces between ceiling beams, where rats and dust were the only company. When staying in a village, the ninja never used inns. Too many questions, too many eyes. Instead, they might sleep in storage huts, in temple outbuildings, or with distant relatives who didn't know the full truth of their guest. Payment was made in chores, or not at all. Names were rarely given. Most of the time, the host would never know they'd provided shelter. A locked barn door might be unlocked just enough to slip in at dusk, then re-locked from inside. At dawn, it would be as if no one had ever been there. The place left untouched, the straw repacked, the air undisturbed. This was how they lived, not in houses, but in gaps between other people's lives. Long missions made sleep even more uncertain. If time allowed, rest came in bursts, 15 minutes at a time, between footfalls of patrols or the creak of a gate. Cold stone, wet earth, dense branches. Whatever surface was available had to serve. There was no concept of comfort, no pillow, no fire. Just the need to let muscles loosen without letting the mind drift. Every position was chosen for how quickly it could be abandoned, every breath taken as though it might be the last before movement returned. And if sleep didn't come, that was fine too. The body could endure longer than the mind thought. Fatigue was not a signal to stop. It was a condition to carry. There were no dreams worth having in those places, only a kind of waiting, and the silence between the tasks. The kind of sleep where even rest had to be done without being seen. Orders were not written down. Nothing was recorded, nothing signed, nothing sealed. Even within the clan, information was treated like a flame, passed quickly, protected carefully, and extinguished before it spread. Instructions for a mission came by word of mouth, spoken quietly by a trusted messenger or senior member. The meeting might happen in a field during the planting season, beside a river during a shared errand, or behind a temple wall just before sunset. No names were used, no details were repeated. The person giving the order often shared only what was absolutely necessary. Location, time, objective, no more. If a question was asked, the answer was often a silence. And when the conversation ended, there was nothing to carry, nothing to hide, nothing to find. That was the point. The less one knew, the less could be taken away under torture or threat. Inside the clan, compartmentalization was strict. One group might know the location, another, the method, a third, the timing. Rarely did one person hold the entire plan. This division wasn't a matter of mistrust, it was survival. If any single part was exposed, the whole could still function. A courier might deliver a phrase without knowing what it meant. A scout might prepare a trail without knowing who would walk it. Even among long-standing members, familiarity did not equal access. Roles shifted constantly. Loyalty was measured by obedience, not by knowledge. Those who disobeyed or asked too much were quietly removed from future tasks, sometimes from the clan entirely. Trust was not given. It was proven again and again, often in silence. And the highest praise a ninja could receive was not being thanked, but being chosen again. Written instructions were considered dangerous. Paper could be dropped, intercepted, copied. Ink could smear. A message, once visible, lived on. Even coded language was avoided unless absolutely necessary. When written notes had to be used, for timing, contact names, or travel routes, they were destroyed immediately after reading. Burned over water, eaten with rice, or soaked in oil to dissolve the fibers. Some were written on leaves, bark, or clay tiles that could be crushed underfoot. Others were hidden in the seams of garments, inside bamboo segments, or behind the labels of sake jars. But these were rare. The standard was voice to ear to action, and nothing in between. Even memory was treated as a temporary tool. Once the task was done, the details were pushed out, overwritten by the next assignment, the next set of movements. This way of operating demanded discipline not just of body, but of mind. A ninja could not afford attachment to information. The plan was never theirs to question or shape. Their role was to receive, understand, and execute. And if asked later, by a stranger, a soldier, even a family member, they would have nothing to confess, because there had been no document, no map, no list. Only a few words spoken under cover of wind or water. And then silence. That silence was not empty. It was full of meaning, of risk, of careful design. In that quiet system, secrecy wasn't just a tool. It was the ground every step rested on. Without it, the whole structure would collapse. And so every order traveled light, moved fast, and disappeared as soon as it had done its job. Training was not just about movement. It was about endurance. Quiet, private endurance that left no visible mark, but shaped everything. The body had to learn stillness not only in safety, but in suffering. Cold was introduced early. Mornings began with exposure to wind and water, sometimes standing knee-deep in streams before the sun had risen, not to build strength, but to erase hesitation. The purpose was not to resist the cold, but to function within it. Shivering wasn't punished. It was observed. When the hands stopped obeying, when the breath became short, when the joints locked in protest, that's when the exercise began. A ninja couldn't choose the weather. They had to carry silence through it. The only comfort allowed was the knowledge that others had stood there before them, and none had been spared the same trial. Hunger came next. Meals were skipped without warning. Sometimes a full day passed without food, and then training resumed as if nothing had changed. The stomach ached, vision blurred, thoughts slowed, and still the drills continued. Carry the load, climb the rope, crawl through the underbrush. Hunger was not treated as a punishment, but as a baseline. The body had to operate on less food, less rest, less reassurance. Those who looked for fairness didn't last. Those who adapted did. They learned to hide the tremble in their fingers, to chew leaves just to quiet the mouth, to drink slowly so that water didn't betray emptiness. The goal was not to numb the pain. The goal was to move alongside it. Missions could stretch longer than planned. Supplies could fail. What remained was discipline. The kind of discipline that didn't announce itself. It showed only in the fact that they kept going. Pain came in many forms, not just bruises and cuts, but twisted joints, torn nails, cramped muscles, insect bites, and sunburn. There were exercises designed not to cause injury, but to invite discomfort. Long holds in crouched positions, barefoot runs over sharp gravel, rope burns from sudden descents. No one explained how to cope. They were simply expected to continue. Bandages were made from old cloth. Herbal pastes were applied without ceremony. No soothing words were offered. Only quiet hands and the instruction to get back into place. Pain was not heroic. It was mundane. It happened every day. And the sooner it became background noise, the better. Even in the worst moments, there was no screaming, no groaning, just a pressed jaw, averted eyes, and the breath held long enough for the body to forget what it was feeling. Sleep deprivation rounded out the foundation. There were drills that began at midnight and ended at dawn. There were missions assigned just as the body had begun to relax. There were nights spent standing in cold rain, watching a distant gate, knowing that missing a signal meant failure. The body begged to collapse, but collapse was not permitted. Sleep became fragmented, unreliable, naps stolen in corners, rest taken with one eye open. And still, focus had to remain sharp. Memory had to function. Reflexes had to respond. The ability to operate while exhausted became its own skill. They weren't taught to wait for better conditions. They were taught to continue within the worst ones. Because the body, over time, stops complaining. It forgets what it wants and does what it's trained to do. That was the lesson. Not how to fight, but how to endure until the moment passed, and then endure longer. A ninja could not rely on doctors. Wounds had to be treated in silence, often in the dark, far from anyone who might help. That's why basic medical knowledge was part of the training from the beginning. Not just theory, there were no books, but hands-on repetition. Trainees learned to recognize the types of bleeding and how to stop them using pressure, cloth, ash, or the bark of specific trees. They practiced packing cuts with powdered herbs, wrapping limbs with torn strips of clothing, and bracing joints with carved splints made from whatever wood was nearby. They didn't aim to heal fully. They aimed to keep moving. A bandage wasn't meant to last days. It was meant to hold until the task was finished. There was no luxury of rest, no safety net. A mistake in the field had to be corrected immediately, with what was on hand, or not at all. Mazes and salves were made from roots, leaves, and animal fat. Each student learned which plants numbed pain, which reduced swelling, which drew out infection. They carried small packets of dried ingredients, ground yarrow, licorice root, mugwort, stored in bamboo tubes or folded paper. Mixing them was a delicate task, done in the field with water or spit, using fingertips or the back of a knife. Sometimes soot or salt was added to prevent decay. Burns were treated with mashed silkworm cocoons or honey if it could be found. Insect bites and rashes were soothed with vinegar or fermented bean paste. All of it was local, gathered over time, tested by use. There was no standard recipe. Each village had its own traditions, each family its own tricks. The common thread was necessity. A ninja could not afford to carry a wound back home. It had to be dealt with where it happened, or not at all. Bone setting was harder. No one expected to heal a break on their own, but they learned how to stabilize it enough to travel. A branch, a strip of cloth, a tightly bound sling. That was all. Dislocations were more common. Shoulders knocked from joints during falls, knees twisted in uneven ground. Resetting them required pain, timing, and strength. There were drills where one trainee practiced joint manipulation on another, not to injure, but to learn the feel of tendons, bones, and muscles under pressure. This knowledge was practical, not academic. No one explained anatomy in words. They explained it by touch. A bruise on the ribs meant shallow breathing. A swelling near the ankle meant weight must shift to the toes. Training included how to move while wounded, how to favor one side without showing it, how to hide a limp until safety was reached. The body became both tool and patient. Sometimes there was no time to treat a wound at all. In those cases, the first goal was concealment. Bleeding hands were wrapped in gloves. Cuts were covered with ash or dirt to dull the shine. If blood stained the clothes, layers were reversed or rinsed in streams. Painkillers were taken only if absolutely necessary, since they dulled awareness. The preferred approach was grit, silence, and constant monitoring. Fever meant infection. Stiffness meant tearing. Numbness meant nerve damage. A ninja learned these signs like weather patterns, interpreting them with quiet attention. When they returned to their village, treatment might continue, but it was done in the same spirit, quietly, with few words, using only what was available. There were no hospital mats, no long recoveries. Healing was part of the profession, not a break from it. A ninja didn't just have to survive the mission. They had to survive the aftermath, alone, with the tools they carried and the skills they remembered. Poisons were not exotic substances acquired from distant lands. They were made quietly, from what grew nearby or crawled beneath stones. A ninja learned early which plants to touch with bare hands and which to avoid. Aconite, foxglove, datura, monk's hood. None of them were labeled, and none of them forgave mistakes. The training was slow and deliberate. Roots were dug with care, dried in shade, ground with bone or stone tools to preserve their potency. Some poisons were intended to be lethal, but most were not. Far more often, the goal was confusion, nausea, blindness, or paralysis. A target who stumbled or vomited would draw attention. A guard who collapsed gasping would disrupt patrols. Sometimes that was all that was needed. The use of poison was never dramatic. It was precise, quiet, and full of consequence. Recipes were passed down orally and never written. Even among those trusted within a clan, knowledge was fragmented. One member might know how to prepare the base, another how to mix it into a paste, a third might know the antidote. This was not paranoia. It was protection. If a ninja were captured, they could reveal only fragments, never enough to replicate the recipe fully. Secrets were not just hidden from enemies. They were distributed, buried within layers of routine and silence. The consequences for leaking a formula, even by accident, were severe. At best, exclusion. At worst, death. Trust was not assumed. Every step in handling poison reinforced the idea that knowledge was both weapon and burden. A misplaced vial, a spilled powder, an unwashed hand, each could kill without warning. Preparation often took place in isolation. The process began with collection: leaves, berries, skins, glands. Sometimes frogs were used, sometimes insects. The substances were crushed, dried, boiled, strained. They were mixed with oils to stick to blades, with rice paste to shape into balls, with ash to disguise the smell. Powders were stored in paper packets, sewn into clothes, or pressed into hollowed-out bamboo. Liquids were sealed in gourd flasks or lacquered wood to avoid corrosion. Everything had to be stable, silent, and easy to destroy if needed. No scent, no color, no trace. Some poisons were timed, effective only after hours. Others acted instantly. A few were absorbed through the skin, requiring no cut at all. Every type had a purpose. Every dose had a risk. And the one who carried it always understood they were carrying something more dangerous to themselves than to any enemy. Despite the danger, the use of poison was not casual. It required justification and approval. It was never applied thoughtlessly. Each instance had to be weighed. What was the goal? What was the cost? And what would happen if it failed? The act itself was simple: coating a blade, mixing into food, dusting a latch or doorknob. But the consequences were complex. One death could collapse alliances. One misused toxin could bring retaliation. For that reason, the poisoner was also the planner, the analyst, and the cleanup crew. After use, the site had to be cleared, tools burned or buried, and symptoms misdirected. The illusion of natural death or illness was always preferred. To kill silently was not the highest skill. To kill and vanish without suspicion, that was the true craft. And to achieve that, the ninja had to understand not only the tools in their hand, but the world around them, the flow of power, and the line between silence and exposure. Fire was a luxury that could not be trusted. Even the smallest flame carried risk, not from its heat, but from its visibility, its scent, its noise. Smoke rose, light traveled, and the smell of burning wood lingered long after the fire had died. For a ninja, whose safety depended on silence and invisibility, these were unacceptable compromises. A cooking fire could betray a position to anyone downwind. A flicker of light could be seen from a distant hillside. And so, on missions or in hiding, fire was used only when there was no alternative, and even then, only under the strictest control. Pits were dug into the earth to trap the glow and filter the smoke. Wet moss and ashes were laid across embers to suppress their scent. Wood was chosen carefully, dry, resin-free, silent burning. But most of the time, there was no fire at all. Cold fingers, uncooked meals, and darkness were simply part of the work. Warming the body meant layering, movement, or endurance, not heat. The layered clothing worn on missions wasn't just for camouflage, it trapped what little warmth the body produced. Straw mats, dried leaves, or scraps of cloth were used to create makeshift insulation in hiding places. Some ninja carried small metal containers that held warm stones, but even these were wrapped in layers to avoid radiating detectable heat. When temperatures dropped, the goal wasn't comfort. It was stillness without shaking. Shivering could draw attention. A snapped twig under a restless foot could break a mission. That's why physical training included exposure to cold, not for strength, but to teach the body how to endure it without panic. There were exercises designed to slow the breath, quiet the pulse, and still the limbs even as the body ached for warmth. A ninja didn't overcome the cold. They learned to work within it, quietly and without complaint. Cooking food created its own problems. The scent of roasting fish, boiling grain, or even simple miso could travel far. That's why many meals were eaten cold, pre-prepared, or raw. Food was chosen for its silence and neutrality, nothing that steamed, nothing that sizzled. Even water was warmed only when absolutely necessary, and only in conditions where the heat could be contained and masked. In the field, most meals consisted of dried rice balls, fermented paste, or preserved root vegetables. If cooking had to happen, it was done underground, using small stone-lined pits that vented horizontally into thick brush or undergrowth. The ground absorbed heat, and the surrounding vegetation trapped scent. These makeshift stoves took time to build and could only be used once. When the meal was done, everything was dismantled, scattered, or buried. No ashes left behind, no footprints around the site. Just cold dirt and the memory of a warm mouthful, quickly forgotten. Even in safe houses or long-term camps, fire was treated with suspicion. A candle might be shielded with multiple layers of cloth or paper. A lamp would be placed deep inside a structure, far from windows or cracks. Light discipline was constant. Movement happened in darkness. Writing was done by feel or in brief flashes of light that were instantly covered. Smoke holes were sealed. Walls were thickened with mud or cloth to absorb the glow. And still, there was tension. Because it only took one moment, one careless flame, one waft of smoke, one glint of light against a metal edge, to expose everything. That fear shaped every decision. It wasn't just about surviving the mission. It was about not being noticed at all. And so, fire became a last resort. The body stayed cold. The hands stayed raw. The food stayed bland. But the silence, the darkness, the invisibility, they stayed intact. And that, for a ninja, mattered more than warmth. Meals prepared for missions had to meet strict conditions. No heat, no noise, no smell, and no waste. The food a ninja carried could not reveal presence, delay movement, or require tools. That's why most of it was prepared in advance. Carefully shaped, tightly packed, and chosen for endurance over taste. Among the most common and practical forms were hikusura, small, dense food balls made from pounded rice, ground seeds, miso paste, dried vegetables, and occasionally dried fish or herbs. Each one could be eaten in 2 bites, with no need to unwrap or reheat. They were stored in cloth pouches or wrapped in waxed leaves, designed to stay dry and intact even through rain, sweat, or long days of travel. A single ball could provide just enough energy to continue moving for another few hours. Not to thrive, not to feel full, just to continue. The ingredients were chosen not only for nutrition, but for silence. Nothing crunchy, nothing that stuck in the teeth, nothing that had to be chewed too long. Grains were soaked and ground, roots were steamed and dried, paste was fermented until stable and odorless. The goal was to create something that could be eaten in darkness, with one hand, without alerting anyone nearby. Even the act of eating was practiced. Slow, discreet, with the mouth covered by the hand or sleeve. No crumbs, no wrappers, nothing to drop or leave behind. Portions were small and rationed carefully. 1 or 2 per day, depending on movement and weather. Hunger became a constant companion, but it was better than the risk of cooking smoke or the scent of meat drifting through the trees. A ninja could survive for days on hikusha and water alone, and they trained for that, body and mind slowly adjusting to what it meant to move while hungry. Sometimes additional items were packed, though always in moderation. Dried plums to prevent cramping. Salted kelp to restore minerals lost through sweat. A small packet of roasted soybeans or powdered tea leaves. These weren't treats. They were tools, measured and calculated like any other part of the equipment. Liquids were carried in gourd flasks or waxed pouches, but only enough for necessity. Foraging was rare during missions unless specifically planned, and even then, only from known, uncontaminated sources. The danger of being spotted while collecting food outweighed the benefits. That's why the pre-mission preparation of rations was treated with the same seriousness as the sharpening of a blade. If the food was spoiled, if it molded, if it leaked, the mission might fail before it ever began. There were no second chances. The body had to keep moving, and it could only do that if it was fueled by something clean, stable, and invisible. After eating, everything was packed away. Wrappers were folded and returned to hidden compartments. Fingers were wiped on stones or cloth, not sleeves. Even the scent of food on breath was considered. Some chewed bitter leaves afterward to neutralize it. Nothing could linger. When the ration bag was empty, it was burned or buried. A ninja did not leave signs, not even of hunger. And when the hunger returned, and it always did, it was treated like cold or pain or fatigue. Not something to solve, but something to manage. Food wasn't comfort. It was function. These small, quiet, handmade meals were not remembered. They weren't missed. They were part of the mechanism that moved the body through the dark, through the forest, through the mission. And when the mission ended, they were replaced with the same things again. Ground, shaped, wrapped, and carried. No heat, no sound, no comfort. Just what was needed, and no more. The missions assigned to ninja were not dramatic. They didn't center on duels, assassinations, or heroic last stands. Most of the time, their work was invisible, unnoticed by those it affected. The true purpose was disruption, quiet, precise, and often untraceable. Information gathering came first. The ninja was sent to observe, to listen, to memorize. They counted soldiers, tracked supply movements, studied guard patterns, and identified weak points in routines. They paid attention to who spoke to whom, which doors were locked at night, where the smoke from kitchens rose. They carried no scrolls or sketches. Everything was committed to memory. Once the information was collected, they left without a trace, carrying nothing but the arrangement of facts in their mind. The success of these missions was measured not in bodies, but in silence. How many questions were asked afterward, and how few answers were found. Other missions involved fire, not to destroy cities, but to create confusion. A warehouse might burn in the middle of the night. A signal tower might erupt in flames just before an army approached. A storehouse of grain could vanish in smoke, forcing an enemy commander to retreat. These fires weren't accidents. They were calculated, timed, and placed for maximum disruption. The ninja learned how to start flames without light, how to delay ignition with slow-burning oils or treated rope, how to mask the scent of fuel until it was too late. Sometimes the goal wasn't the fire itself, but the reaction to it. Soldiers pulled away from key posts, villagers panicking in the wrong direction. The enemy made to look careless or weak. And while the flames raged, the ninja was already gone, far beyond the smoke, watching quietly from the next hill. Sabotage was another common task. It might involve cutting supply lines, loosening cartwheels, fouling wells, poisoning animal feed. It might mean disabling weapons, cracking bowstrings, removing fletching from arrows, soaking powder stores. These actions took time, patience, and access. A single person, working in the dark, dismantling part of a larger machine, one quiet step at a time. The goal was never total destruction. It was doubt, delay, miscommunication. To make the enemy second-guess their own security. Sometimes a gate would open too slowly during an attack. Sometimes a horse would go missing at the wrong moment. The ninja wasn't seen. Their name wasn't spoken, but their presence was felt in everything that went wrong. The power of sabotage wasn't in the act, it was in the uncertainty it left behind. Assassinations did occur, but rarely. Killing brought risk. A body drew attention. Blood left stains. Questions were asked. Retaliation followed. The art of the ninja was to avoid all of that. Their best work left no trail, no enemy to chase, no obvious event at all. And when death was required, it was carried out with the same care and restraint as every other task, swift, quiet, and without spectacle. But more often, the true mission was much simpler: to sow disorder without being noticed, to make people doubt what they saw, to create hesitation. And in that hesitation, battles were lost before they began. Villages fell without a siege. Leaders made decisions based on the wrong reports. Armies arrived too late. All because somewhere, sometime, someone had moved through the shadows and touched something others didn't even realize had changed. That was the mission. Not to be feared, not to be known, only to be effective. Killing was not the goal. It was the last resort, used only when silence had already failed and escape was no longer possible. A ninja was not trained to seek death, but to avoid it, for themselves and for others. Their greatest value lay not in how many they could eliminate, but in what they could observe, remember, and report. Information was the currency of their craft. Who met whom, when a gate opened, how many guards changed shift, which officer argued with which merchant. A dead man could reveal nothing, but a quiet observer, unnoticed in the rafters or crouched beneath the floor, could change the course of a campaign without ever drawing a weapon. That's why missions were planned around evasion, not confrontation. Every lesson reinforced the same principle. If you kill, you're already behind. Force created noise, and noise created exposure. Even a silent kill, a blade in the dark, a throat cut clean, left behind a body. And bodies brought questions, searches, tension. If a ninja's presence was confirmed, the mission failed, no matter the outcome. Survivability was more important than eliminating a target. Escaping with what was learned was worth more than any single life taken. That's why many carried no lethal weapons at all. They relied on tools for climbing, hiding, watching. If conflict arose, it meant something had gone wrong. The better the ninja, the less likely they were to be remembered at all. Their success was measured in invisibility, in the smooth continuation of life around them, even as they slipped in and out of it. The target continued breathing, unaware they had been seen, and that ignorance was the true victory. There were times when killing was permitted, when a betrayal had to be punished, when a threat could not be allowed to speak, when survival demanded silence be enforced with blood. But even then, the method mattered. Clean, fast, without suffering, without witnesses. A poisoned cup was better than a dagger. A staged accident better than a struggle. And afterward, no trace. The weapon discarded, the disguise removed, the exit planned in advance. These were not moments of triumph. They were burdens, accepted with discipline and regret. Within the clan, those who had taken lives rarely spoke of it. There was no ceremony, no tally, only a quiet understanding that something irreversible had occurred. Even when justified, the act left a mark, not on the blade, but on the person who had used it. That's why training focused not on combat, but on avoidance. How to step without sound, how to breathe without movement, how to distract with light or scent, how to become part of the background until even danger passed by without stopping. These skills were harder to master than any form of fighting. They required patience, humility, and a willingness to be invisible. The ninja was not a hero, not a warrior in shining armor. They were a shadow that passed, a silence that lingered. And in that role, they served their purpose best, not by ending lives, but by preserving secrets, not by spilling blood, but by ensuring that no one ever knew they were there at all. Observation required more than eyes. It demanded presence without presence, learning how to remain unseen even in full view, how to occupy a space without disturbing it. The ninja trained for this constantly, until stillness became second nature. They could blend into shadows, yes, but more importantly, they could blend into normality. In marketplaces, they stood like merchants. On temple grounds, they walked like pilgrims. But when the situation demanded absolute invisibility, they retreated into forgotten corners of the world, abandoned homes, unused storehouses, dry wells, hollowed-out trees, even disused crypts. These places offered more than shelter. They offered silence, neglect, the kind of emptiness no one looked into twice. Inside those walls, the ninja waited, listened, and watched, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The goal wasn't simply to avoid notice. It was to erase the idea that anyone was ever there. Podslushowania, eavesdropping, was one of the most valuable skills, and one of the most difficult. It required proximity without interaction, positioning without sound, and a constant awareness of surroundings. Roofs were used often, especially in wooden towns where sound carried through thin walls and paper screens. A crawl space beneath a floor, a small gap behind a rice wall, a space behind a hanging screen. These were all standard listening posts. Movement had to be timed with voices. Breathing slowed to match the rhythm of footsteps. The ninja learned to read body language through silhouettes, to detect emotional shifts in tones, to memorize conversations with a single hearing. They carried no ink, no paper. Everything stayed in the mind until it was safe to speak. And if someone stepped too close, if a servant paused unexpectedly, the ninja didn't run. They froze. Even a flinch could give away their presence. The discipline was total. The body had to believe it wasn't there. Urban areas offered networks beneath the surface, tunnels, drains, storage pits, and foundation voids. These were mapped not on paper, but in memory, passed down from those who had crawled through them before. Some led beneath walls, under roads, or straight into courtyards thought secure. They weren't clean or easy. Most were narrow, damp, infested. But they allowed passage without sightlines, without guards, without noise. The ninja learned to navigate by smell, by touch, by the curve of stone under their palms. A cracked wall might serve as a checkpoint. A change in air pressure might signal an opening. Moving underground required the same patience as listening above. A complete surrender of comfort in exchange for freedom of movement. It was not glamorous. It was cold, claustrophobic, slow. But it worked. It allowed access where no door existed. Escape when no window remained. At the heart of all this was the simple principle of being close without being known. 2 steps from a guard, beneath the same roof as a target, behind the wall of a private room. Not disguised, not distant, just unseen. This required more than silence. It required anticipation, knowing when someone would turn, when a dog might bark, when a child might point. It required humility, no glory, no name, no witness, and it required deep familiarity with fear, not to avoid it, but to recognize it, manage it, and continue acting despite it. For the ninja, this was the real craft. Not weapons, not acrobatics, but presence without weight, listening without breath, a shadow in a space already forgotten. And once the mission was complete, no trace remained. No one searched the room, no one remembered the silence, and the work, though dirty, though invisible, was done. The shuriken, or throwing star, holds a powerful image in modern imagination, lethal, precise, unstoppable. But in practice, these small blades were tools of disruption, not instruments of death. Carried in small cloth pouches or tucked into sleeves, they came in many shapes: 4-pointed, 8-pointed, cross-shaped, or simple sharpened coins. They were compact, easy to conceal, and quick to deploy. But they were not made for killing. Most lacked the mass or velocity to penetrate deeply. A well-placed throw could cause pain, distraction, or a superficial wound, but rarely enough to disable. The true value of the shuriken was in timing. A sudden flick of movement to startle a guard, make a horse rear, or draw a sentry's eyes away from something more important. In many cases, they were thrown not at the enemy, but at nearby surfaces, posts, trees, walls, where the noise or motion could redirect attention. They were cheap, easily made, and easily lost. Often crafted from discarded metal, broken tools, or scrap farming implements, they were never treasured like a sword or dagger. A ninja didn't mourn the loss of a shuriken. It was meant to be expendable. Carried in sets of 4, 6, or 8, each one served a different situation. Some were coated in irritants, pepper, rust, or plant-based toxins, not to kill, but to sting or blind. Others were deliberately dulled, designed to strike and bounce, creating noise rather than injury. Their effectiveness came from the moment of confusion they created, not the damage they caused. And because they were small, they could be used in places where larger weapons were impractical. Tight corridors, rooftops, forest undergrowth. But once thrown, they were rarely retrieved. Searching for them took time and attention that the ninja couldn't afford to waste. Training with shuriken focused on speed and accuracy at short range. The goal was not to embed the blade deeply, but to hit a specific target within a narrow window of movement. Targets were often wooden boards, bundles of straw, or tree trunks, all marked with chalk or string. Practitioners learned to throw from various positions, standing, crouched, running, even while falling or rolling. Each motion had to be fluid, integrated into the broader movement of the body. There was no time to stop and aim. The hand moved as the eyes shifted, the fingers released in mid-motion, and after the throw, there was no pause. The ninja continued forward, backward, or away. The shuriken was not a climax. It was a beginning. A way to open a window of opportunity, to unsettle, to interrupt. It was a punctuation mark, not the sentence. In most missions, the shuriken never left the pouch. Stealth was more valuable than speed, silence more important than force. Drawing a weapon, even one so small, meant accepting risk. If it clattered to the floor, if it missed and struck a stone, if it was recognized in the aftermath, it could unravel everything. That's why ninja were taught to rely on position, on preparation, on escape routes. The shuriken was there in case things went wrong. Like a flare in a storm, it was bright, sharp, and brief. It could change a moment, but never win a battle. And when the stories grew over time, when the myth of the deadly star replaced the reality, the people who once carried them would not have corrected the tale. Let others believe in the drama. The truth, as always, stayed quiet, small, sharp, and thrown only when absolutely necessary. Every item carried had to be invisible or indistinguishable from something innocent. A blade could not look like a blade. A rope could not look like a tool of escape. A vial of powder had to pass for medicine or seasoning. The danger was not in being seen. It was in being stopped. If questioned, the ninja had to appear as a common traveler, a merchant, a farmer, or a pilgrim. Anything more specific invited suspicion, and suspicion led to search. That's why every piece of equipment was designed with plausible deniability. A sickle could pass for an agricultural tool. A walking stick might conceal a hollow core. Even clothing was neutral. No symbols, no tailoring that suggested status, no weapons openly displayed. If arrested or searched, the only acceptable outcome was confusion. The captors had to see nothing more than a poor, quiet man moving through the countryside. Preparation for this kind of invisibility was meticulous. Blades were shortened to hide within sleeves, handled with cloth to avoid wear marks on the skin. Pouches were stitched into hems and sandals, too small to be obvious, too soft to bulge. Powders were wrapped in wax paper or stored in gourds with false bottoms. Lockpicks, wires, and hooks were made thin, flexible, easily snapped and discarded. Some tools were even edible, crafted from rice and hardened paste, to be swallowed or crushed in a moment. The goal was not to win a fight if captured, but to erase the reason for a fight entirely. If a soldier opened a bag, they needed to see nothing worth questioning. If a magistrate searched a body, they needed to believe they'd caught the wrong man. There was no uniform, no code name, no badge. The best defense was ignorance, on both sides. The penalty for being identified as a ninja was death. Not trial, not imprisonment, execution. Spies were not treated as prisoners of war or as common criminals. They were traitors by default, regardless of allegiance. That's why secrecy extended even into the moment of failure. If caught, a ninja was expected to maintain the illusion, not through bravado, but through silence. No confessions, no explanations, just confusion, denial, and the hope that no one connected the fragments. In some cases, poison was carried for this very reason, not to use on others, but on oneself, should capture make secrecy impossible. This was not framed as sacrifice. It was framed as duty. The mission was never just the objective. It was the entire trail, the whole context, from departure to return, or disappearance. The tools were part of that, and if the tools were found, the person carrying them had already failed. Even in moments of rest, the awareness remained. Every item had to be ready to hide again. If shelter was shared with strangers, gear was packed away under straw or buried outside. If a guard passed too close, movements slowed, hands stilled, breath held. There was no room for error, because one slip meant everything collapsed, not just for the ninja, but for those who had trusted them, for those who might be named under pressure. That's why the equipment was treated with such care, not as sacred objects, but as liabilities. They were essential only until they became dangerous. And when they did, they were burned, buried, or thrown into rivers without hesitation. The mission mattered. The knowledge mattered. The person did not. And the tools, sharp, quiet, and always hidden, were a reminder that survival didn't depend on what you carried. It depended on whether anyone ever knew you carried it at all. The body carried the cost of the work. It didn't look like the stories. No sculpted strength, no polished balance, no heroic posture. Instead, the body of a ninja was lean from deprivation, stiff from repetition, and worn down by years of quiet damage. Bruises never fully faded. Muscles strained under constant tension. Knees ached from crouching too long on hard ground. Ankles rolled from uneven paths in the dark. Wrists cracked from too many landings. Every part of the body carried a list of injuries that were never quite healed. There was no time for rest, no access to medicine beyond what they made themselves. Pain was not exceptional. It was permanent. And because it was permanent, it had to be ignored. The body kept moving not because it was strong, but because it had been trained not to complain. Food never lasted long enough to repair what was broken. Even when not on a mission, the diet was minimal. Dry rice, fermented paste, wild roots, water from streams. Protein was rare. Fat even rarer. The body didn't build itself up. It maintained the bare minimum. Bones became prominent. Fingers trembled at rest. Cuts healed slowly, and old wounds reopened with the slightest strain. There was always a shortage of nutrients, of sleep, of stillness. And yet the training demanded more. Every day brought more running, more climbing, more silence under strain. Every night meant sleeping in damp clothes, in a crouched position, with one hand on a hidden knife. This wasn't discipline for its own sake, it was survival. The body learned to keep going when it wanted to stop. And then it learned to do that again, day after day, year after year. Inflammation became constant. Joints swelled after cold nights. Teeth ached from grinding during long watches. Skin cracked in winter and bled from crawling through underbrush. Infections flared where bandages were late or absent. Parasites came with untreated water. Backs curved early. Vision blurred from too much time in darkness, too little sleep, too much squinting through cracks in walls. These were not rare conditions. They were normal. Every ninja knew the soft warning signs of their body failing. When the breathing became too loud to hide, when the fingers stopped bending, when the limp became noticeable. But they kept going. The mission didn't pause for swelling or exhaustion. The message still had to be delivered. The wall still had to be climbed. The camp still had to be observed. The body could break later. For now, it served. Strength, when it existed, was not explosive or showy. It was quiet endurance, the ability to carry one's weight through the forest for days, to hold a position without movement, to carry someone else's body through a tunnel if needed. It was not about combat. It was about continuation. And even as the body wore down, that was what mattered most. Not how well it fought, but how long it lasted. The scars were hidden, not because of shame, but because they didn't matter. Everyone had them. Some from ropes, some from falls, some from blades too close in the dark. They weren't badges of honor. They were just the truth beneath the clothes. And when the ninja finally stopped, when the mission was over or the body refused to go on, there was no ceremony. No thanks. Just a new name taken by someone else, a new body trained to endure the same. The pain stayed behind. The work moved forward. No one asked where he went, because no one expected an answer. In the villages where ninja families lived, silence was part of daily life. People disappeared for days or weeks at a time, returning without explanation and never questioned. The practice wasn't born out of fear. It was necessity. Missions depended on secrecy, not only from enemies, but from friends, neighbors, even blood relatives. A slip of the tongue, a curious glance, a well-meaning question could unravel weeks of planning. So the rule was simple. If you weren't involved, you didn't ask. If you were involved, you said nothing. Children were taught early to ignore absences, to accept vague answers, to look away when something didn't make sense. The safety of everyone depended on pretending not to notice what might later become dangerous to know. And over time, that habit of not knowing became second nature. Family ties didn't override protocol. Wives didn't know where their husbands had gone. Parents didn't know what their sons were carrying. A brother could be part of one mission and a sister part of another, with neither allowed to speak of it. Even within the same household, roles were compartmentalized. One person might prepare food without knowing who would eat it. Another might stitch garments without knowing where they would be worn. There were no goodbyes, no welcome homes. The work happened in the space between recognition and denial. It wasn't cold. It was calculated. The less that was shared, the less that could be betrayed under pressure. Loyalty to family was expressed not in words or closeness, but in the discipline of keeping them uninvolved. Protecting them meant keeping them ignorant, even if it meant living as a stranger in your own home. This secrecy extended beyond the village. When on assignment, a ninja left behind every trace of their identity. They traveled under false names, wore different clothes, used different dialects. If someone from home recognized them in the wrong place, the rule was to turn away. No contact, no acknowledgement. The mission always came first. To be seen was to fail. That's why ninja were trained to detach from their personal lives, not emotionally, but practically. The role of son, father, neighbor had to be set aside the moment the assignment began. There was no overlap, no blending of domestic and operative life. Letters weren't sent, messages weren't delivered. Births and funerals were missed, not because the person didn't care, but because caring couldn't interfere. When they returned, they didn't explain. They simply picked up where they had left off, as if nothing had happened. This isolation was never complete. Bonds remained, even if they were quiet. But the work demanded that those bonds be hidden, set aside, sometimes severed. Not out of cruelty, but out of caution. A captured ninja could be interrogated. A careless question from a child could be overheard. The clan survived because its members understood that secrets protected more than missions. They protected lives. And so every departure was silent. Every return was without celebration. The ninja lived among their people without fully being known. Their footsteps blended with the rest. Their hands did farm work like everyone else. But their eyes watched differently. Their silence held more weight. And everyone who lived beside them understood. The less you know, the safer you are, not just for them, but for yourself. Many ninja lived behind ordinary roles, working visible jobs that kept suspicion away. Some were blacksmiths, fixing farming tools and shoeing horses. Others were herbalists, gathering plants for medicine and preparing poultices for fevers or wounds. A few worked as simple farmers, tending rice paddies or growing vegetables along the edges of the village. These professions gave them reasons to move between settlements, to interact with people from different classes, and to carry tools that drew no notice. A sickle in a farmer's hand was expected. A bundle of roots on a herbalist's back meant nothing. The disguise worked not because it was clever, but because it was boring. The goal wasn't to disappear into the shadows. It was to blend into the rhythm of normal life, so well that no one ever thought to look closer. The routine of these cover lives was maintained with discipline. Tools were used for real labor, not just appearance. Fields were actually planted. Customers actually visited. The ninja learned their trades well enough to pass scrutiny from merchants, officials, or local elders. Their knowledge had to be practical, because they could not afford to make mistakes. A poorly repaired blade might raise questions. A misidentified herb could cause harm. And in communities where everyone knew everyone else, any slip stood out. So they worked hard, not only to maintain their image, but to reinforce trust. That trust was their shield. If a stranger came asking questions, the neighbors would say, "He's just a smith? She's only a healer." The cover was never meant to be a lie. It was a second truth, real enough to survive examination, shallow enough to abandon at a moment's notice, because disappearance was always part of the plan. Every ninja living under a false identity knew the signs of collapse. A patrol that stayed too long, a question asked twice, a visitor whose shoes didn't match their story. When those signs appeared, the cover was dropped without hesitation. Tools were left behind. Homes were locked or abandoned. Routes were taken through back trails, rivers, or mountain passes. Sometimes the person vanished completely, appearing months later under a different name, in a different trade, in a different village. The people left behind didn't ask. They assumed sickness, marriage, conscription. And if someone did ask too much, they were quietly warned to stop. The ability to vanish was not just physical, it was social. A ninja's life was never built around permanence. It was built around how quickly and cleanly it could be dissolved. Even so, These covers weren't just protective, they were strategic. A blacksmith could gather information from soldiers. A farmer overheard gossip from travelers and tax collectors. A herbalist was often welcomed into homes, trusted with private ailments and family troubles. These positions allowed access to spaces where a stranger would be noticed. They offered excuses to travel, to carry unusual tools, to return to the same house more than once. The ninja used these roles to study patterns, test boundaries, and sometimes to plant the early steps of a larger mission. And when the time came, when a message had to be passed, or a storehouse burned, or a guardhouse observed, the shift happened without ceremony. One moment, a craftsman. The next, a shadow. The face remained the same, but the role was gone, folded up like a robe and left behind, ready to be replaced. Failure meant more than death. It meant erasure. If a ninja was captured during a mission, whether by patrol, by enemy clan, or by accident, the response was immediate and absolute. The clan denied all connection. No rescue would be attempted. No negotiation would be opened. The person in question ceased to exist in the minds and mouths of those who trained with them, lived near them, shared meals and silence. Names were not whispered. Faces were not described. Even family members followed this rule. Parents turned away. Siblings looked through empty space. Spouses grieved privately but never admitted the loss. The logic was cruel but simple. One broken link could endanger the whole chain. The risk could not be allowed to grow. And so, disappearance became the only possible future for anyone who failed to remain unseen. This wasn't a betrayal, it was a known cost. Explained early, reinforced often, and never questioned. From the beginning of training, each recruit understood that their work was solitary, not only in action, but in consequence. Support existed only as long as the mission remained intact. The moment a mistake was made and the outside world took notice, that support evaporated by design. It wasn't a matter of judgment. It was procedure. The work was too delicate, too interwoven to survive exposure. One person's failure could unravel years of effort, endanger dozens of others, or provoke retaliation. So the price was paid in advance, accepted before the first assignment was given. Loyalty flowed in one direction, for the mission, for the clan, for the silence that held everything together. It never flowed back to the one who was caught. Sometimes the disappearance was literal. A captured ninja who escaped and returned to the village was not welcomed. At best, they were sent away with provisions and silence. At worst, they were executed quietly before they could speak. The danger wasn't that they had talked. It was that they might have. Suspicion was enough. Doubt was fatal. In rare cases, they were allowed to live in exile, alone, nameless, under watch. But they never returned to the ranks. They were never trusted again. More often, they simply vanished, absorbed into the larger countryside as farmers, laborers, or wanderers, never speaking of who they had been. Their names were erased from records. Their tools were burned or buried. The people they knew continued on without them. And in time, even memory faded. That was part of the discipline, letting go of what was dangerous to remember. This rule was harsh, but it worked. It kept the clans alive, it preserved the network of silence, and it reminded everyone involved of their role. You moved for the mission, not for yourself. You endured for the cause, not for reward. And if you failed, you did not expect mercy. The ninja were not heroes. They were instruments, sharp, silent, replaceable. The moment one cracked, it was removed and forgotten, for the sake of all others still in motion. There were no statues, no stories, no graves. Only the path forward, cleared by the disappearance of those who stumbled. This knowledge didn't inspire fear. It inspired precision. Every step was measured, every word was weighed, because everyone understood. If the mask slipped, you weren't just in danger. You were alone. And in that silence, you became nothing. Payment rarely came in coins. More often, it was measured in bundles of rice, a new tool, a warm meal, or a vague promise of future protection. Gold wasn't handed over for silence. The value of a mission completed was calculated in survival and stability, not in profit. When a landowner or minor lord sent for the services of a ninja, they understood the exchange was practical, not luxurious. A quiet task deserved a quiet reward. A few sacks of grain delivered in secret. A new pair of sandals, sturdy and stitched well. Access to a safer road. Word spread through whispers that someone had been useful, and that was sometimes reward enough. To live another season, to keep one's family from starving, to know the roof might hold another winter, these were the currencies that mattered. Not prestige, not wealth, just continued existence. Most ninja didn't see themselves as professionals in the modern sense. They weren't mercenaries with open contracts and price tags. They were craftsmen of secrecy, bound more by obligation than by ambition. The knowledge passed down in the clans was not meant to create personal fortune. It was to preserve the village, the family, the code. Some missions were done without any reward at all, simply because it was expected. Because the clan elder asked. Because the balance of power in the region demanded intervention. There were no complaints, no negotiations. When told to go, they went. And when the work was done, they returned to their homes, if they had homes, without ceremony. Maybe a meal was waiting. Maybe not. They rarely asked for more than what they were given. They had been taught not to expect thanks. Even when coin was part of the deal, it came with risk. Money drew attention. A sudden purchase, a better robe, a new roof, might make neighbors suspicious, might raise questions. So even when a ninja was paid in gold, they often buried it, hid it in floorboards, traded it slowly over time, through middlemen. It wasn't a path to comfort. It was a burden to manage. Some preferred not to accept it at all. A few families even had unspoken rules. Never take coin from strangers. Only food, only tools. Easier to explain, safer to forget. The idea of living richly from the shadows was fantasy. In reality, shadows fed you only enough to survive. More than that made you visible. Visibility was death. There were exceptions, times when a wealthy lord might reward a particularly dangerous or critical mission with something grander. A piece of land, perhaps, or a protected name. But these were rare, and often came with invisible chains. To be known by someone with power meant they could summon you again. At any hour, with any task. You became theirs more than before. And so, many refused such rewards, choosing anonymity over recognition. The old code was simple. Live small, stay quiet, and never believe the work would make you rich. It might save your family. It might preserve your life. But it would never elevate you. That was the cost of walking in silence, and it was paid not just with risk, but with the absence of reward. They left no graves, no carved stones, no family shrines. Many ninja vanished the same way they lived, quietly, without trace, without record. Their names were never written in temple books. Their bones were never mourned by villagers. When they disappeared, There was no certainty if it was death or a deeper kind of silence. The clan did not send for them. Families learned not to ask. Even their students, if they had any, were trained to move forward, to replace the name with the task and the memory with the lesson. It was not seen as cruelty. It was necessity. A broken branch is forgotten so the tree may survive. That was the logic. That was the law. In the rare instances where a body was found, it was left unnamed. A traveler fallen in the woods, a fisherman washed ashore, a thief caught in the wrong place. No badge, no symbol, no story. If someone suspected more, they stayed silent. It was safer that way. The death of a ninja meant nothing to the world outside the clan. It wasn't reported. It wasn't avenged. It was absorbed, like mist, into the earth. That was the trade for the life they lived. No one knew them, so no one would remember them. If a name was ever whispered, it was done in private, behind doors, without witnesses. And even then, only briefly, just long enough to close the chapter. Some did try to leave something behind. A son, a student, a mark carved into a tree that only another ninja would recognize. But these were rare indulgences and often discouraged. Attachment made one vulnerable. Legacy was a risk. The ideal ninja left no burden for others to carry. He passed on his knowledge, not his name. If he died well, it meant his absence created no ripple. No one asked where he went. No one followed his shadow. There was no ghost to speak of, only the echo of discipline. The emptiness he left behind was the final proof of his success. His death was the last secret kept. This is why the history of ninjutsu is broken and scattered. The scrolls that exist are fragments, the stories half-true. What we know is built from guesses and contradictions, because the people who lived it were not meant to be remembered. Their greatness was measured by what they erased, not what they achieved, and so most of them passed into soil and silence. No graves, no heirs, just the shape of their absence. That's the legacy of the unseen. That's the price of becoming no one. When the wars ended, so did the purpose. The Sengoku period, once filled with shifting allegiances, night raids, and covert operations, faded into history. As the Tokugawa shogunate unified Japan in the early 1700s, the country entered a time of relative peace. Castles were no longer under siege. Daimyo no longer plotted in whispers. Armies were no longer hired in secret. And with that peace came silence, the kind that swallowed entire ways of life. Ninja, once a necessary tool in the arsenal of feudal lords, became relics of a war that no one wanted to remember. Their skills, once vital, became dangerous liabilities in a world where loyalty to the shogun was paramount and suspicion meant death. The clans in Iga and Koga, those mountain enclaves that had for centuries trained operatives in silence, began to dissolve. Some families tried to adapt, disguising their arts as folklore, dance, philosophy. Others turned to more mundane work: farmers, guards, monks. A few continued the training in private, but without purpose, without patronage, the edge dulled. Missions became memories. Techniques were no longer passed down as lifelines, but as curiosities. Stories of the past, embellished, warped, forgotten. Scrolls decayed, paths overgrew. The discipline that had once shaped entire generations was now a fading echo in an indifferent world. By the middle of the Edo period, being a ninja was no longer a profession. It was a myth. Samurai held prestige, merchants held wealth, peasants held land. But the ninja held only shadows, and the world no longer needed them. The state had spies of its own, more modern, more loyal to the central government. Surveillance came from bureaucracy, not from hidden men in treetops. The work of infiltration gave way to paper trails and permits. Assassination was replaced by exiles. Panic was no longer a weapon. It was a crime. The skills that had once made ninja invaluable now made them dangerous outcasts, or worse, irrelevant. And so the knowledge unraveled, bit by bit. One generation forgot a technique. Another forgot the meaning of a phrase. The masks were folded away and never opened. The bodies softened. The instincts dulled. And the world, for the most part, moved on. By the time historians came looking, there were only fragments. Phrases that could mean anything, names that pointed nowhere. A few old men claiming lineage to something they could no longer prove. The rest? Silence. Because the last trick of the ninja wasn't how to kill or how to hide. It was how to vanish so completely that even memory couldn't follow. And in that, they succeeded. Some slipped quietly into the fabric of village life. They took up tools instead of weapons, carried firewood instead of scrolls, and greeted neighbors with nods instead of passwords. Their hands, once trained to disarm traps and scale walls in silence, now split bamboo or guided oxen through rice paddies. What remained of their skills was folded into ordinary gestures. How to tread softly through the forest, how to read the sky for shifts in wind, how to listen for movement even while threshing grain. No one asked questions, and no one offered answers. The war was over. The need for silence persisted, but its purpose had changed. Now it was not about survival on a battlefield. It was about surviving within the rhythms of a world that had forgotten the value of men who could disappear. Some found new callings at the margins of official life. They became guards for merchant caravans, tax collectors in remote provinces, hunters in rugged hills where few dared follow. Their understanding of terrain, of movement, of watching without being seen, all of it had value, even if no one recognized where it came from. These men never wore masks, but they still watched the world like ghosts. They learned the names of animals by sound alone. They followed footsteps through grass crushed an hour ago. They knew where a man might stash stolen coin, or how to follow someone without being followed back. They were useful, and so they were tolerated. But always at a distance. No one truly trusted a man who could track you in silence and leave no mark behind. Others simply disappeared, not in death, but in repetition. They married, bore children, aged. Their pasts were never spoken aloud. Their names were sewn into family ledgers, not scrolls. Their knowledge drifted down through daily habits. How to tie a rope, how to bind a wound, how to disappear in a storm. The sons learned some things, the daughters too. But without context, without need, it was only half knowledge. A trick, a habit, a way of moving that no one could explain. A few of these families still lived near the old places. In Iga, in Koga, in valleys with names no one could quite pronounce. But the houses were like all the others, and the people inside them laughed at the word ninja like it belonged to someone else. And yet a residue remained, a way of being, a certain posture when standing near danger, a certain stillness before movement. Not tradition, not anymore. Just instinct passed down through repetition. Something in the wrist when tying bundles, something in the eye when measuring distance. These men no longer fought. They no longer served. But something in them remained watchful. A fragment of a world built on caution, adaptation, and silence. A world that was never recorded, never rewarded, and never remembered, except in the way a man steps carefully across wet stone. or how he knows when to duck before the roof beam. Nothing heroic, just survival, pressed deep into the bones and handed down not with words, but with motion. History remembers the wars, the emperors, the battles. It remembers the dates carved in temple stone and the names etched into the backs of statues. But it does not remember the faces of those who were never meant to be seen. No scroll speaks their names. No ink draws their likenesses. The ninja were not written into the center of history, but into its margins, between the lines, in coded language, and in the silence that follows a question left unanswered. They left no monuments, no bloodlines to inherit their titles, no graves that tell you what they did or who they were. Only their absence remains, a carefully maintained void where a legacy once breathed. The documents that survive speak not of individuals, but of roles, instructions, strategies, and lists of tools, each reduced to function. A grappling hook, a smoke pellet, a pair of silent sandals. These were the remnants of a human life. The ninja were deliberately erased from their own craft. Anonymity was the profession's most sacred oath. Each trick, each method was passed down without pride, without signature, without attachment. A son did not learn his father's name in legend, only his technique. Survival meant letting your ego rot away in the dirt. Let others chase glory. You chase the moment when your presence becomes indistinguishable from wind in the reeds. In time, even those traces faded. Schools dissolved, languages changed, and the enemies they were trained to fight became allies or memories. The ninja vanished not in battle, but in peace. Their secrets no longer needed, their skills misremembered or folded into myth. What were once tactical manuals became curiosities. What were once tools of war became props for tourists. In stories, they gained powers they never had, disappearing in smoke, climbing sheer walls, flying through forests like ghosts. The truth, colder and quieter, sank below the surface. A life of hunger, of shadows, of sacrifice, of silence. And so the last ninja disappeared just as the first once emerged, from nothing into nothing. If you stood where they once stood, you would find no footprints. If you looked into their past, you would see only fog. Their story is not one of heroes and villains, but of absence. They erased themselves with the same discipline they used to erase others. All that remains is a profession with no faces, a silence with no voice, and a history that forgot them exactly as they intended. Now you know. They weren't legends, not really. Just people, hidden, exhausted, forgotten. The life of a ninja wasn't about glory or magic. It was about silence, about patience, about becoming no one, for the sake of something greater. Close your eyes now. Let their shadows drift back into the dark. Tomorrow, we'll uncover another forgotten world. But for now, rest. Let the noise fade. Let the night take over.